This is Wolf Spirit Radio.
Good evening, my brothers and sisters. It's that Saturday night. No, this is Friday night. This is Friday night, therefore it must be time for the New World Order Race with Time with the one and the only Crystal Clark and Maharad McDonald, if she's there, and Mr. James C. Horrick. And here we go with your host.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. Myra is our co-host as well, and she might be joining us a little later this evening. For new listeners, the Race with Time radio airs live the second and fourth Friday of every month on Wolf Spirit Radio from 7 to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. The shows are free to listen live. If you do want the MP3 files, you'll have to download those and become a subscriber. Dave's rates are good, and I highly recommend subscribing because you also get access to all of the other shows on the network. The topics of discussion for this evening address historical anomalies and mysteries, including the Conehead people, the elongated skulls people, the JFK assassination, and other associated characters being simultaneously involved in a cancer-causing monkey virus cover-up, as discussed in Edward T. Haslam's book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. Now, those familiar with our show are those who listened to our last episode with special guest Karen Hudis will recall that we tried to share some of these topics with her during that show. It didn't go quite as well as we hoped, but perhaps we should explain why we tried. We've all been through this, with our friends and our family and our loved ones. Let's suppose that someone you know and love or care about is a young woman talking about vaccinating her child. Knowing what vaccines can and have done to children, because we care, we feel compelled to say, maybe you should look at this other material before you make up your mind. Sometimes they're open to what we have to say, and sometimes they aren't. And we have all been through this. The harder you push, the harder they push back, and nobody gets anywhere. We do what we do because we care. We try to share the information with people. If they aren't ready for it or they don't want to hear it, you have to let them work it out on their own, the same way we worked it out on our own and that we were allowed to do that. What we don't do with folks that we've tried to help that just aren't ready for it, we don't become spiteful. We don't submit them to witch hunts. We just let them work it out on their own. Now, as far as, Karen Hudis goes, is she who she says she is? Is she doing what she says she's doing for the reason she says she's doing it? I don't know. I can't answer that. What I can say, and why I support her in her efforts, is that I personally don't see any downside to returning the stolen and plundered wealth of nations. They're still doing it. We saw this with Gaddafi in Libya. His gold disappeared. The same thing just happened in Kiev. Their gold disappeared. And, this has been going on, excuse me, for thousands of years. How do you think these people acquired their wealth? They plundered it. That really needs to stop. And I appreciate her efforts in that regard to return the stolen wealth to the people that it rightfully belongs to. Now, James, would you mind if we addressed the Coneheads and the elongated skulls people before we get into the JFK assassination? Because I want to make sure we have enough time to cover that completely. Would that be all right with you?
That would be fine, yes.
Okay. So the first thing I want to point out is before you explain this is that the Conehead people and the elongated skulls people are in fact two different people, and I think that's where some of the confusion is coming from. So take us through what happened in the past with these folks, James.
In different parts of the world, we have people who had established civilization that had reached the mound builder or stone builder, monument builder class, where these people had religious centers, what we would call cities today, but basically they were temple cities. This was in Egypt, and this was in South America, in Central America, Mexico. And they had a tendency to emulate a certain style or shape of head. And they would take their infant and put two boards, sandwich the head at a slope to shape that head like the classic Mayan countenance that you see on so many of their pictographs and their codices. The Egyptians didn't do this, but they had a dynasty of pharaohs who left mummies with the elongated heads, and they were exaggerated. They were far more extensive in size and length than what you see as an emulation of them by cultures that persisted right up to Columbus, the discovery of the New World, or I wouldn't say discovery because that's disputed, but the pre-Columbian period. The impetus for doing this in the cultures in Central America, Mexico, and South America was basically because they'd been visited by the same people that represented that class, that dynasty that came from somewhere else and had this particular characteristic. And they shared technology to some extent. They were looked upon as son of the sun, or Ra, designated Ra. And the tradition started there, although they died out because they didn't interbreed with mankind. And, we'll never get the truth from researchers because they're under the duress and suppression that everyone else is in the forbidden archaeology that Cremo writes about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But a simple DNA would determine whether they could produce children with Homo sapien or not, but they didn't. In fact, their issue to that line of each pharaonic, I'm getting feedback.
Yeah, I did too a moment ago. It may pass. Let's see.
Yeah. The issue to the pharaonic line was determined by incest. And the reason for that was because they couldn't interbreed. And they later on, though, that tradition continued. Just like in other parts of the world, the idea of emulating the elongated heads of people that came from the stars. And when they were represented in written histories passed down, they were signaled to be coming from the sun. Of course, that's not true. But these people made an impact, enough of an impact that this tradition persisted, and the elongated heads that are generally found are not exaggerated as much as those that are found in the mummies and royal tombs from the era of that particular dynasty in Egypt. However, there are some that might have been people from elsewhere that have been found in other parts of the world. I think if we really knew the truth about this one find in the Grand Canyon, my guess is that there would have been remains found there, and it probably would have attached to the elongated heads. We're dealing with some evidence, some speculation, and probability. That's how you have to approach these problems, because we know that we're being denied information, that finds that are made throughout the world, if they don't fit the preconceived notion that is put out by institutions that are controlled by financial groups, they don't want this information understood. They do not want us to know the truth about much of anything, if it has any depth to it, that attaches to prior lineages, that attaches to the fact that we're not alone in the universe. Today we face a trend that is kind of a interesting irony, where the New World Order that decided 40 years ago that they would employ the hostile alien thesis in order to finally implement the last stages of the New World Order, at the same time having spent the last 70 to 80 years suppressing information and evidence that ET is present, even among us. This is a real twist. They're in a paradox. So they have to go outside of the mass media. They have to go outside of conventional news and conventional institutional wisdom in order to build that. So they're using a corrupted element of the alternative media to do that. That lends itself very well to it. And like I stress, if there were hostile ETs, we wouldn't have a chance against them anyway. But the mere fact that there's no evidence of any hostility whatsoever, I have mentioned as well that there is an importance to discerning between EBs, extrabiological entities, and extraterrestrials. Extraterrestrials are sentient, have a full complement of intelligence. EBs are not. EBs are, as I described, sewn together chunks of meat with a computer terminal. And that's basically what they are. They are problematic, and they are useful to military black ops, and they are probably going to create some scenario around them. And they've already started fictionalizing a great deal about the ET presence, trying to make them more menacing. They do this through the abductees, and the problem with that is that abductees are jaded, they are corrupted, not morally or otherwise, but in what they've seen. And the people that use this hypnotic memory recovery are not to be trusted. So as I said, there is no clear evidence in any respect that ETs are hostile. And I make this point because what I'm discussing right now, I don't want anyone to misinterpret that the Egyptian Pharaoh dynasty was trying conquest. They were caught here because of a paradox, tried to make the best of it, and thought that they would lend themselves to trying to influence humanity to go a different route that they had in former lineages. And that's about the crux of it.
All right, so the elongated skulls are not from this planet. They understood the history of our planet, though, in that we had had 6 previous extinctions and lended whatever they could to us in the hopes that we would avoid the 7th. Is that right?
Well, the exaggerated one, we have to understand that there are people that grew up with their head distended, sloped back because of the way this had been induced from infancy by the boards pressing down to create that elongated skull in emulation of what they thought was visiting godhood at one time.
Right, so not all of the skulls that they found that are elongated are truly the elongated peoples.
No. In fact, the elongated skulls that pertain to these people are very exaggerated compared to those that they find that have been treated with this misshapen head.
I see. So the longer ones are more often than not the originals.
More often than not, yes.
Okay.
Yes, and of course, they might have recovered some in other parts of the world. I'm sure they have. These people, there were a number of them, and they had their influences throughout. But at the same time, they were guarded about their remains. They were guarded about trying to keep from having an overall cultural influence technologically. But at the same time, doing what they could in Egypt, for instance, to try to refine civilization to be less brutal. And they did. The Egyptian peoples, compared to Rome, they weren't. And the idea that they used slaves to build a pyramid is ridiculous. But that persists, and that persists because the truth is untenable to people that want to control societies and install global control that has been their dream for 300 years.
All right, so in a previous show we talked about how Moses was Akhenaten. Was Akhenaten one of these peoples?
No.
Oh.
Akhenaten was a nationalist, and he wanted to establish monotheism for the sake of pushing his nationalist agenda. And of course, there had been for 500 years in Egypt a number of priest castes, all that had their own gods and their own burial techniques. Whoever controlled the house of the dead, for instance, was the top of the pile of the priesthood castes, and that changed hands from time to time, usually due to intrigue. Poisoning of key people was common. Poisoning had become an art form.
So the same shenanigans are still going on today.
They are. They are indeed. In fact, There are several agencies in the world that have laboratories constantly working on covert ways of assassinating people and blaming it on heart attacks or suicide or whatever. That's become an art form. And of course, when you have all the resources that you could ever want, both delegated to you by appropriation or through theft or heroin cells or whatever, like our CIA,
the drug industry.
you can afford R&D on the highest order. But, of course, you have to worry about leaks.
Yeah, and this is really sad, and I want to point this out again because when you have unlimited resources and all you use it for is to master death instead of life, this is the mindset that causes these extinctions. And that's really important for people to understand. I thought it was interesting what you said about the elongated skulls people. Were they able to mate with human beings?
I don't think so. I know that, for instance, we have peoples here that I refer to as the blondes, and a lot of other people have, long before I ever spoke about them. They could mate with people and have children here, but they prefer not to, and they're rather adamant about that. It's a cultural ideal of theirs that they don't do this. So that's a different form of grouping. It's kind of like what the anthropologist Kroeber described as nonspecific aggression. But of course, as far as them speciating, that would still be a matter of time.
James, explain nonspecific aggression for folks. I don't think they really know what that means.
Kroeber described this. He had been someone that gathered naturalists' work that had gone back to Darwin and a number of other naturalists, but long before anthropology was as distinctly a discipline in science as it had become in Kroeber's day. The information he compiled indicated to him that the grouping that we see among all animals that become isolated, the population becomes isolated. It can become isolated in two ways, either geographically, or it can be isolated because certain traits favor a certain grouping, and there is a mechanism when it reaches a certain point that one group won't reproduce with another group, and that's called, and they'll be aggressive about isolating that group from another group as far as reproduction is concerned, and that's called nonspecific aggression. And when that starts, and we see elements of that today among humans, we see it building. It raises its head at odd times, but it's usually beat down because the people that promote this sort of thing don't usually stay in power long enough to make it successful. I mean, it was behind the Third Reich. It was behind people today. It's a false mechanism because there's one thing that's very important. And, of course, this will throw eugenics on its head, and that is that if you have a healthy species, adaptable species, the larger and more varied the gene pool is, the more adaptable it is to changes in the environment. So when you start confining due to ethnocentricity or racist doctrine or whatever it is, you are actually weakening the chances for your own species to survive.
Right.
So, we really should be a one pill for all peoples on this planet, and that would make us much stronger. And it would keep these mongrel tyrants from having that axe to grind, wouldn't it?
Yes, you can't race bait people if they're, even today a lot of people have been really surprised. They've had their lineage done, and they're part African, they're part Indian, and it surprises a lot of people because they don't know their genetic history, and it's very true, and I think that's important to point out, that genetic diversity isn't just variety isn't just the spice of life, it aids survival in the long run.
That's right. Nobody should look down on anybody else because they decide to build a family with someone of a different color, race, or whatever, because actually they're improving the genetic pool by doing so. There are people that get upset over hearing that because they think that there's spiritual values involved in whatever. True spiritual values allow for everyone. They tolerate. They have and maintain tolerance. And that's what true religious leaders should focus on. And the fact that they don't means you don't have true spiritual leadership.
That's true. And in fact, many religions today encourage their followers to only marry people of the same religion.
That's right. Well, that's wrong. That's wrong because spiritual confinement is not spiritual. If you don't have tolerance, the first thing that we should all learn, that we should teach our children, is to be tolerant of others. If that was a guiding light principle, a lot of the problems that occur in the world, which lead to genocide, lead to the kinds of things that kill so many people in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in South Africa, that were done on the basis of racial hatred just wouldn't occur.
Ethnic cleansing, yes.
Ethnic cleansing is the greatest evil on the planet, but it's not the most threatening. The most threatening we have today, and I watched a video that demonstrated this very casually, is that we have people in power that want to start getting rid of the aged, simply because they are the more extreme of the category they describe as useless eaters. This is going on in England right now.
Yeah,
and
I think that's part of Obamacare as well, yeah.
Yes, it's part of Obamacare. This is a form of, I would call
it's
it...
elitism, really, is what it is.
Well, it's a form of genocidal cleansing. But depopulation is what these monsters have been talking about for 40 years. It's been in their publications. It's been described and shared with people by whistleblowers that have been on the inside or known people that were on the inside who casually said, well, this is just evolution. Well, it isn't evolution.
Survival of the fittest garbage. Yeah.
Yeah. We're not supposed to be animals. We're supposed to be people.
That's right.
And animals don't do this to their own.
No, they don't.
So what we have here is we have people who pervert anything and everything that they can to implement their agenda, and their agenda is evil. Of course, you can sublimate all you want, but when you're talking about killing other people to make things more convenient for you, more profitable for you, more economical, et cetera, it's evil. It's wrong. It's wrong. There's no justifying it. And, most people have been taught this. They've been taught this because it's elemental to so many teachings. But after you watch Star Trek and you watch other things like that, you're kind of led into this BS that circumstance determines the extent of that. Well, it doesn't. It's like the end justifies the means or the greater good. Anytime you hear that, you're dealing with a person that has abandoned philosophical, spiritual, ethical values for evil.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a sad thing that we have religions who teach their people that people with dark skin, whether they're Native Americans or Africans, bear the mark of Cain, and that they're less than human. There was a time they said women didn't have souls. I mean, we really need to grow out of that. It's not befitting of a civilization that is sentient. It doesn't make sense. But what ultimately happened to the folks with the elongated skulls? Did they die out because their only way to procreate was with each other, or was it something else?
I think that's what happened. I think that some of them went home. That happened, but there were some that elected to stay because they had become deeply involved in the culture. But now let's get to the Coneheads.
Yes.
The Coneheads, we have throwbacks to the Coneheads today. Remember, we once had hemophiliacs, and they were just about terminated because of a contaminated batch of blood. What's really interesting is how do you have such a thing happen at one time universally without it being intended? The answer is you don't. So we could say we've already had a form of cleansing right there. The same thing happened to the coneheads. Today, the throwbacks that we have, we call them microencephalics. If you look at the head, it's cone-shaped. Elongated heads are not cone-shaped.
Yeah, explain what microencephalic means.
That is genetically determined, and it causes the forehead to slope inward and for the head to shape the form of a cone with a point. Just like an ice cream cone. At one time, when this gene pool that caused this particular genetic determination was vaster than it has, just like with hemophiliacs, there's still some hemophiliacs that'll be born, but of course nothing like there were back before that contaminated batch of blood got out all over the world suspiciously. In between two of the Inquisitions, one of the popes decided that they had already decided, in fact, the papacy in all its great ecclesiastical wisdom decided that coneheads had no souls. They were employable. They had their own society. They worked in tanning hides and different things, kind of like the Ainu in Japan did, and kept to themselves. They didn't commit crimes. They were an affectionate people. And if you see them today, you'll find that though they do have diminished mental capacity, that it doesn't affect their socialization skills, it doesn't affect their ability to learn how to do jobs and even develop skills. Well, this was even more so back in the 15th century, 16th centuries.
And the coneheads are not from elsewhere. They're a different branch of humans, is that right?
A certain genetic configuration can produce a conehead today, or microencephalic. It's still possible. It's very rare because, there's just not very many of them to contribute. Getting feedback again.
Yeah. It works itself out, so let's see.
All right.
Yeah, so far. Okay.
So, when the papacy decided to practice genocide of its own kind, the Huguenot massacre in Paris, France, the last of the coneheads were part of the matter.
Explain the Huguenot
massacre. That didn't survive in written history, So many things don't.
Explain the Huguenot massacre for people who don't know, James. This isn't something they teach in school anymore, so.
They were considered heretics by the church, and of course they had no inkling that they were going to be massacred. They were invited to Paris to sign a treaty of pacification, and of course when they got there they were massacred.
Wow. And were the coneheads also given this same offer?
Oh, no. They were just rounded up. That was part of the package. Of course, they had been persecuted. These were the kind of people that if you put them to the question, which was what the Inquisition called interrogation, they wouldn't do well. And, of course, it always led to them being either burned at the stake or being drowned or hung, depending upon what the fashion of the day was.
Now, a few days ago, you posted a video on your Facebook page. It was an old film. It's in black and white. I can't remember if it's maybe from the 30s, where you
1932. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And there were conehead children in this film.
Yeah. Those were coneheads, and you can see for yourself, that movie was made at a time where they used real freaks. The movie's name is Freaks. And it used real freaks. Everyone in there is a circus freak. To me, they're not freaks. They're just different. You will see, I think there are 3 of them in it, if I remember correctly, and they're very affectionate, very warm. They have a diminished intellectual capacity, but we have a lot of people that usually go into politics that have diminished intellectual capacities. These people are too good for going into politics, though.
I've found, James, that people with diminished mental capacity are really some of the kindest people because they don't have the capabilities to try to figure out how can I manipulate people and how can I run the world and grow my empire. They just don't think like that.
No, they're not mechanistic at all. I've never heard of any that were, and to think that they were godless or that they had no spirit or soul and all that, it's just absolutely ridiculous because they're like children. They're quite interesting people. I wouldn't want to harm one for $1 million. But the church took issue with them because, it didn't fit into their scheme of things, like even today. So,
well, hell, according to them, even women didn't have souls, so you can see how stupid that is.
Well, there are people that believe that today.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate.
There are people that believe that today, yeah.
So they believe they were born from an individual with no soul?
You cannot let the one mistake that we make with our religions is that we let them percolate until the religious leaders start to speak for God. Now, in my belief or my attitude towards this is that blasphemy isn't saying God damn or anything like that. Blasphemy is when you try to speak for God. That is my idea because I see that as evil, and what someone does when they lose their temper, I don't. I don't expect that people really want to believe in hell. But why do they? They do because I think a lot of them, not all of them, I wouldn't try to speak for a group, but I think that people have a tendency to believe in hell because they don't get any justice here on earth, and these bad critters running around and getting away with pedophilia and raping economies and everything, you want them to pay, and you don't have any hope that they're going to pay in their lifetime. So, you kind of soothe over your anger by believing they're going to go to hell. Well, it doesn't work that way. If you want justice, find a way to obtain it.
Wasn't it Napoleon James who said that religion was there to keep the poor from murdering the rich?
Well, he proved he felt that way towards the end of his life.
Yeah, and it is another form of don't stand up and fight because they're going to get theirs in the end somewhere else, which is very unfortunate.
There's so many of these lies. You have, just wait for the second coming and we'll be lifted.
The rapture, the ascension.
Yeah, we'll have our rapture and our ascension and all. And this goes on. It's not just religious groups that are doing this. It's the woo-woo crowd, light workers, all these other groups that want to sublimate what they can't live with truthfully or don't want to live with truthfully.
It's the same message. It's been rebranded, really, is all it is.
I would like to explain something about prayer, since
sure.
we're on this subject.
Sure.
The wisest of the spiritual guides that I have ever known have all taught the same thing with respect to prayer. That prayer is a resignation. It is after you want something, you care about something so strongly that you intently focus on it. You do everything you can to accomplish it yourself. Everything. Whether it's an understanding, you study, you find all the sources of information that you can. You do everything that you can earthly do. Yes. And then you resign to an outcome hoping something's going to click. A poet might call it the muse. A religious leader might call it the spirit. Whatever it is. And Indians talk about this. Indian folklore and Indian myth has a lot of wisdom. Whether it's East Indian,
it's very beautiful.
Because these people have gone out of their way to preserve the best of their traditions. We don't. Industrial societies lose that context. It's very sad.
It's very destructive, which is why it's sad.
But the Coneheads were a people that were gentle, and they were interesting. Some of them were intelligent, but probably have an IQ higher than most normal people. They had leaders and they had a society and they were doing well. And they got on the wrong side of the Vatican. You know what happens when you have a society that has that kind of power.
Yes, and so it is really absurd to try to blame the behavior of the Jesuits or whomever else on people like Coneheads, because
it's absurd to blame all the evils that's being perpetrated on the working class today
Yeah.
on the Jesuits, because the Jesuits are a part of it. That's agreed. That's agreed.
It's a finger on one really big hidden hand.
And another thing, the irony of our experience with Coneheads is that the worst things that are happening in the area of the Jesuit, it's the secret alliance they have with Zionists.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people really don't understand about Zionists because, you know, you've heard that saying, to find out who rules over you, find out who you can't criticize. And the moment you use the word Zionist, oh, you're an anti-Semite, and, you know, that has nothing to do with anything. And not all Zionists are Jews, and not all Jews are Zionists. There's a very clear distinction to be made there. But going back to the Coneheads, I do want to point out, though, James, in the video that you posted, as well as a series I just finished watching on Netflix. It's the American Horror Story, and it's got Jessica Lange, who is a nun running an insane asylum for the Catholic Church. And one of the residents there is a Conehead. Her name, as an actor, she goes by Pepper. And she even talks about having been put in the asylum because she's a Conehead.
That's right.
And she looks just like the other children in the other video that you posted. And I think it's important to point out that when we say Coneheads, we're not talking about the Saturday Night Live skit where their heads were 2 feet tall and went to a point. That's not what they look like.
No.
No.
No. Now, in the society, when there was a group of them, there were some that had a much more higher pronounced shape of head, just like with the elongated heads. There were some of the people that had that deformation, that skull deformation done to them when they were in infants. They had a rather pronounced elongated head. But most of them didn't. Most of them, it just affected the forehead, the slope of the forehead, and then there would be a narrowing of the skull towards the back. It didn't improve intelligence. It didn't improve anything. And I'd like to say one other thing. This idea that greater skull shape or capacity is not important to intelligence. It's the size of the cranial cavity. Cro-Magnon man from the skulls had a greater cranial cavity than Homo sapien. They were very intelligent, but there's no indication that they were super intelligent. I've said before that if you took children from the earth and you took them to societies off earth, different peoples, maybe even that they couldn't breed with, to live among them at the age of 4, 5, or 6, they'd fit in, they would be productive, they would have unified consciousness, they would be just like anyone else, might not look like anyone else, but they'd fit in equally. So this concept that the elongated head would give 30% more intelligence or whatever, that's not true either. What set these people apart in Egypt was their technology.
I see. Were they involved in the construction of the pyramids?
No, not the Great Pyramid. Of course, pyramids were built, but not on that scale. The Great Pyramids, or pyramids of that size, where the stones fit so well together,
right,
they go back to the last lineage. There's a pyramid that they're discussing, that they're talking about, that's underground in the Ukraine. Now, that pyramid may go back probably to the 3rd lineage.
That's old.
That is old,
yeah.
Now, it's not millions of years old, but
it would be really, really old, though.
It is a possibility. There are things that pop up from time to time, like that spark plug that was found in a lump of coal that came from a mine at 3,000 feet down. Mm-hmm. That comes from millions of years ago. Because,
found? Yeah.
The earth, before your ancestors came here, Crystal, the earth had already been through era transformation over and over again. Things had happened. There were even peoples at one time that used the earth as a slaughterhouse for their food. They populated these dinosaurs. And, of course, the dinosaurs are counterproductive to the environment.
Yes, they're way too large.
They're way too large. They compact the earth. They tear up streams, lakes, everything else. So they weren't a naturally evolved species for the Earth. But there was a reptilian peoples that this was what they ate.
And when you say reptilian, we're not talking about people that look like human snakes, right?
No. In fact,
human lizards.
I speak about them I loosely call them reptiles. They're cold-bloods. Some of them you would consider very attractive. Their eyes are a little different, and they're a little bit more different. Their bones are softer than ours. And they have 2 hearts.
Wow.
And, yeah, they're quite interesting. They have a different digestive system. You can't breed with them, but they don't come here. They're advised not to because of the onus towards people like that that's here.
The hysteria, yeah.
You know, the ETs all know that mankind is intolerant here.
Yeah. They've been taught to be afraid of their own shadows, which is unfortunate.
I've seen some people you would probably be alarmed at their appearance, but they use psychic blocking.
I see. James, there was a message posted here from the chat. Can James talk about the cathars and what was the catharsis?
I'd like to know what the person means with respect to context.
You know, I don't know, James. I read it exactly the way Dave posted it here. It just says, can James talk about the cathars? Who are the cathars? Why don't we start there?
It could be one of 2 things. I'd like to know what tradition they're related to, because it would go into a lot of detail in one way or the other. And we don't have a lot of time. We need to get to the other topics we want to talk about. But if this person will give me some idea about in what context they want to talk about this, I'd be happy to oblige in a later show or, online at our blog.
On the blog? Yeah.
Anything. Yeah, anything. I'm not trying to dodge the question. It's just that I've kind of meandered around.
No, you've done it beautifully, James. You've explained the difference between the Coneheads and the elongated skull people very beautifully, I think.
I would like to add one thing more to that, Crystal, and that is if people are students of art and visit museums and they see paintings that were done during that period, 16th, 17th century, they'll see Coneheads. Now, you'll be told, oh, well, that is a depiction of a person that's a heretic or that or whatever. And when these people are put under Inquisition and wear the dunce cap, well, that comes from the tradition of how they treated the Coneheads.
Yeah, as though they're subhuman.
Yeah, but you will see there is one, I believe I saw it in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, that depicts the massacre of the Coneheads.
Oh, really? It depicts the massacre?
Yeah.
Wow.
I believe it's in the John G. Johnson collection in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But that John G. Johnson collection is well worth a trip. If you're in the area, it's well worth a trip to downtown Philadelphia because it's the most extensive art collection that's ever been collected. It's John G. Johnson collection, and it is extraordinary. It has more of the Dutch masters, more of the Impressionists, more of the pre-Raphaelite period painters, and Van Eyck has 2 or 3 Peter Paul Rubens, has El Greco, has just all of the greats. It even has Picasso and has a sculpture, Bird in Flight, of Picasso's. It has his Woman Descending Staircase from his Blue period. It is a fantastic collection.
Now, there was a message posted here. It looks like it got removed, but somebody was wanting me to put in links to the references we made to what Coneheads look like. I can't put the links in here, but just to reiterate, on James's Facebook wall, if you want to friend James on Facebook, you'll find the film that he posted from the 1930s that has 3 Coneheads in it. And also, for those people that the American Horror Story is a series, and it is a horror story. So for people that don't like that kind of thing, I don't recommend it because it is pretty dark, but it's really very good. It's called The American Horror Story. I think it's the 2nd season. It's
The one that's called Asylum.
Asylum, yes.
Asylum,
It's where
yeah.
the Catholic nun is running this asylum, and one of the residents there is a Conehead. Her name is Pepper, and she talks about being a Conehead. So, and if you compare the two, you'll see that they look very, very similar. And it's not that their head goes to this, really protruding point, but their heads are shaped differently. But they're not like the Coneheads on Saturday Night Live, where it looks like somebody took an orange street cone and put it on their head. No, they don't look like that.
The most exaggerated that you'll see, including in the painting that I described, is about half. It's in between Pepper and the Coneheads that you see on Saturday Night Live. They can get that exaggerated, but not any more than half that. And that's usually the men.
Oh, I see. Well,
yeah.
You see that a lot, especially in animals, where the male half of the species has, they're fancier to attract their mates, so that makes sense. So for folks in the chat, Dave just posted a link here from beforeitsnews.com with enormous cone heads of Paracas, Peru found. Now, I can't click on it here or it will crash my Skype because my computer is so old, so I don't know what they look like. But those two films will give you a pretty decent idea. So how about if we take our first break because it's the top of the hour, James, and when we come back, we'll focus solely on the JFK assassination as well as how that bleeds into Dr. Mary's monkey. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right, Dave, are you there? Are you ready to give us a break?
This is Dave from the Wolf's Den Studio saying welcome to Wolf Spirit Radio. Wolf Spirit Radio is totally listener supported by folks like you who choose to help us stay on the air and grow.
All right, so the rest of our show this evening is going to be about JFK, and it's important too to point out that as I mentioned in the beginning, some of the characters involved in the JFK assassination are also involved in another really ugly conspiracy and cover-up, and this deals with cancer-causing monkey viruses in the polio vaccine. And now this comes from a book called Dr. Mary's Monkey, How the Unsolved Murder of a Doctor, a Secret Laboratory in New Orleans, and Cancer-Causing Monkey Viruses are linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and emerging global epidemics. Now, hopefully, I'm going to try to, I haven't tried yet, so I can't promise anything, but I would like to get this, this was written by Edward T. Haslam, and I would like to get him on the show to continue this dialogue, which we had actually talked about doing before, doing a show about JFK, and then directly after that doing a show about Dr. Mary's monkey, because the same players are involved in both of these scenarios. And one of those is this fellow, David Ferry, that James has talked about many, many times. He's the fellow who was a pilot who was experiencing extra cosmic bombardment and solar radiation because he was flying at high altitudes and he lost his facial hair. So he's involved in both of these. Now, I do want to read a little bit from the beginning of this book. The foreword was written by Jim Marrs. A lot of people are familiar with him. He's written books on JFK as well. And what he has to say in the foreword, I think, is really excellent. There is nothing new to learn about the assassination of JFK. Words like these have become almost a mantra among sanctimonious media pundits and complacent publishers. The problem is that they're not true. And I think that's very, very important. There is one other part that I do want to read from page 9 on the foreword, because this again goes back to some of the same characters. I don't want to read too much of it. Let me see here. Okay. In his 1995 book, Mary, Ferry, and the Monkey Virus, Haslam opened a whole new can of worms when he revealed the medical experiments that had taken place in David Ferry's apartment in 1963. He was one of the first to bring to the public the now well-documented story of how polio vaccines of the 1950s were adulterated with a cancer-causing virus derived from monkey glands. Federal certification officers were aware of the possibility of the polio vaccine being defective, but were pressured into approving the vaccine by powerful medical interests anyway. Now, I do want to quote something that James said in our last show because this also goes along with what we're talking about. Get here. Okay, so at 39 minutes and 25 seconds into episode number 9, this is with Karen Hudis, James said, David Ferry was an interesting character. When Oswald was in New Orleans, he was civil patrol squad leader, and the day before the assassination, a taxicab driver had driven Oswald, David Ferry, and Jack Ruby to the Carousel Club from Love Field, which is the only large airfield in Dallas. It's almost in the middle of town. This taxicab driver came forward with this information after Jim Garrison, the district attorney in New Orleans, was secretly indicting Clay Bertrand Shaw, David Ferry, and a couple of other men for conspiracy in the assassination of JFK. And his investigation got leaked before he meant it to, and that night, David Ferry was, as we say these days, suicided. So you have an awful lot of the same players in both stories. So I just wanted to make that point. Scanning this very quickly. Okay, now this also comes from the foreword of this book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. It is now well accepted that officials within the federal government of the United States of America took steps to effectively block and derail Garrison's probe. It seemed the New Orleans investigation was at an end. But what if all that activity in New Orleans had nothing to do with the assassination? What if there was some other reason for sabotaging Garrison's investigation? After all, there is not one hard piece of evidence linking the Shaw-Ferry axis to the events in Daley Plaza. Ferry, the man connected to Oswald, the mob, and the CIA never got closer to Dallas than a Houston phone booth, and there was never any serious accusation that Clay Shaw went to Dallas. Could there have been a deeper secret reason why the Garrison investigation had to be shut off? And could that reason have had more to do with contaminated polio vaccines and the secrecy of a deadly biological weapon experiment than any plotting against President Kennedy? Okay, so we have these players involved in both scenarios. Now, we've talked about this privately in terms of what may be the best way to approach this subject, James, because I'm one of those people, and there are a lot of people my age and younger who were born after all of this happened. We're not taught about this in school. We're not taught about all of the variables involved. So let's begin. Let's try to create a movie in people's minds who weren't born yet, who don't have any idea what was really going on at the time, in terms of the geopolitical landscape that contributed to all of this. So was the Cold War going on? What was going on at the time? And then after you explain that, we'll go through the characters one by one so that people can understand who these people were and what their roles were.
Well, Kennedy was not tailored for the presidency. His older brother had been. He was the one that was supposed to take up that position when he got back from the war. The powers that be owed Joseph Kennedy that favor. And so Joseph Kennedy Jr. was killed in action, and it fell to JFK. JFK wasn't prepped the same way, and he really meant to be a good president. He really meant to represent his nation humanely, decidedly loyal to the Constitution, and his brother followed in his footsteps. When his brother became Attorney General, he created a crime commission, and this crime commission irritated the devil out of J. Edgar Hoover, people like Hoffa, and a number of other people, because he was gathering information that J. Edgar Hoover had and was using for his own purposes. J. Edgar Hoover used his files to run his own agenda, and that agenda ended up being part of the cover-up of the investigation of who killed JFK. He hated Bobby Kennedy, and a lot of people that have analyzed this more closely think that Robert Kennedy was a real target, but they couldn't get Robert Kennedy until after they got his brother.
So I want to qualify what you said about JFK being prepped. He wasn't turned into a monster. That's what these people do with their eldest sons. They turn them into monsters like themselves, that they will follow the code and continue the work of their ancestors. And so JFK was not prepped that way.
No.
He ended up in that position, which is why we, for once, actually had a decent man as president.
I don't believe he was a womanizer while he was in the White House, that people were led to believe he was, because he had a back injury, and you can't be, he couldn't be flexible enough to really do that in the style that most womanizers want to do it. He had bouts with his back throughout his administration. In fact, when he was in the war room and Westmoreland was trying to bully him into releasing everything they had against the Soviet Union, he was agonizing over his back, and it was his brother Bobby that came up and said, no, we're not going to go down in history as having started World War III.
And I want to make sure that people really understand what you just said. He was being pressured to launch nuclear missiles.
Yes.
Yes.
This actually starts over two developments. One is that Fidel Castro, when he came into power, got rid of the private beaches around Havana so that everybody could use them, and he ran the mob out of Havana, where they had the most lucrative casinos of the day. And Jack Ruby ran one of those casinos.
Oh, wow. Well, welcome, Myra. Thank you for joining us. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry I'm so late.
Okay, so Jack Ruby owned a club in Cuba.
No, he ran one. He ran it for Jake Lansky, Meyer Lansky's brother. At the time of the assassination, he was a bagman in Dallas for Carlos Marcello. And the 5 months prior to, well, up to 2 months before the assassination, he was getting calls from Carlos Marcello and calling Carlos Marcello every day on the phone. 2 months prior to the assassination, that all stops.
Okay, well, let's go back to the landscape before we get into the characters, the geopolitical landscape. What was the Bay of Pigs about, and what was going on?
Well, there were two things that are important to discuss before we get to the Bay of Pigs. One is that the United States had begun putting missile bases in Turkey. This caused the Soviet Union to react and approach Fidel Castro about putting missile bases in Cuba, which is basically, if you make comparisons, very similar. It's tit for tat, really.
This is where the hostility began.
It began because they had picked this up. They were flying the U-2s at the time, and they could pick up with aerial surveillance that they were building these bases. Of course, a lot of this is driven by anti-Castro Cubans who've left Cuba because they were part of the former regime or they were involved in organized crime down there, whatever. But they had left, and they had formed a community in Miami. They were very vocal. And
okay, so I want to make sure this point really gets across. So the anti-Fidel Cubans were crooked people. He was trying to clean things up, and that's
no, a lot of them were good, decent people. They just felt like that they wanted to be able to return to Cuba. They wanted to have that option. They had left loved ones there or whatever, and they felt that Castro, of course, they were being fed American propaganda too. So they felt like that was one of these tyrannical regimes like had been under Batista. So they were good people, too, you know.
Okay, I see. So when you explained that they were victims of American propaganda, that filled that gap in. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were. They thought that was a fly-by-night dictatorship, and, of course, it didn't turn out that way. But the tenor of things in the United States was that Castro had to be gotten out. And, of course, when those missile bases and the fact that Cuba was starting to establish strong economic ties with the Soviet Union, and this just outraged the idea of Americans. We were still under the Monroe Doctrine, pretty much. And, of
Explain
course,
what that is, James, because most people don't know. What's the Monroe Doctrine?
Monroe Doctrine is the end product of the concept of manifest destiny, which justified all of the actions that the United States took against Mexico and France and anyone else that interfered in their realm of influence in South America, Central America, Mexico, And, right up to the French and Indian War, prior to a war for independence against England, Canada. We sent expeditionary forces into Canada during the French and Indian War, and there were concerns even then that we might take Canada and incorporate it in the United States. There were people that wanted to extend Manifest Destiny to Canada too. Of course, the Canadians didn't like that idea. There was more diversity in Canada, so you had the French Canadian and the English Canadians, and they hadn't settled their differences. So who wants a country that is on the verge of a civil war themselves? So that's maybe the only thing that saved Canada from that. After the end of the French and Indian War, things became pretty set as far as official diplomatic attitudes of whatever administration was in power towards the expansion of the United States and its incorporation of Texas, incorporation of New Mexico, Puerto Rico, eventually Hawaii. All of these came under the Monroe Doctrine, which meant stay out of here. If anybody's going to incorporate these territories, it's going to be the United States. And this attitude persisted right on through the use of the School of the Americas in Washington, D.C., in providing, educating would-be dictators that would be puppets for American diplomacy and fitting them out with secret police.
James, was the Monroe Doctrine born out of a constitutional convention?
Mm-mm.
No.
Oh, no. No, it was a policy.
Okay.
There's every difference in the world between amendments and policies. And it was a policy, and it was adopted from one administration to another. The impetus for it was so great that no American leader, whether he's a president or statesman of any kind whatsoever, would dare challenge it, because it would just the way it was. I mean, what we were doing was trying to become commensurate with England.
So did this begin the attitude of what's ours is ours and what's yours is ours?
Well, if you were in the wrong part of the world, yes. Well, of course, the English, remember the famous English saying, the sun will never set on the English empire?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, well, that is probably one of the most arrogant attitudes there ever was. It's something that even Genghis Khan wouldn't enunciate, were he to have a press corps. But,
Okay.
It's funny how people forget all these things, and they forget the Opium Wars and so forth.
Let me ask you one more thing before we go forward.
Sure.
Okay, so this was around the time of the Red Scare and all that, being terrified of communists.
No, it was a little bit after. Of course, the McCarthyism was still hot and heavy.
But was this in line with the report from Iron Mountain, the directions that they were taking at this moment?
No. In fact, the report from Iron Mountain hadn't even been produced. The idea originally behind the report from Iron Mountain was President Kennedy commissioned it as a research paper or work to be done on what impact it would have on global economies and the U.S. economy specifically if we had world peace.
This was commissioned by Kennedy?
Yeah.
Okay.
After Kennedy was killed, it was still in the cogitation state of several think tanks who decided to pervert it to a blueprint of establishing a new world order. And that's what it became. But that wasn't Kennedy's intent.
No, okay.
Now, LBJ was a machine boss politician here in Texas before he became vice president. And even he, when he received the report from Iron Mountain, said, "Get that away from me. I want nothing to do with it." So even he was a better man than to go along with that monstrosity.
Okay, let me ask you this very quickly, and then I promise I won't interrupt you for a while. I just want to make sure that we aren't skipping anything so that people can piece this together, because it was before so many of our times.
Sure.
All of these really wonderful and still very important speeches that Kennedy gave before he died, where he knew that there was a hidden hand and he intended to expose it. What was going on that alerted him to this hidden shadow government and their nefarious intentions?
Probably what had happened to LBJ on his flight back to Washington, D.C. with the casket of Kennedy's body in the plane after the assassination, when there was a reporter sitting right across the seat from LBJ, and he said that LBJ got a phone call, and in it his face turned ashen white. He was being given his marching orders. They probably tried to do the same thing to JFK over Bobby Kennedy, because Bobby was getting into stuff. Bobby had found out that the owners in organized crime were fixing the unions together. And this would have made waves that would have changed a lot, because owners would rather deal with corrupt mafia figures than legitimate working class stiff union leaders. And that was the whole crux of it. And of course, Bobby was going to go after that. Bobby's going to clean the unions up. And also he was crossways with J. Edgar Hoover, because J. Edgar Hoover had always said that there's no organized crime. And Bobby begged to differ. And so, Of course, this touched on a family friend of the Kennedy family, Onassis, who was the world head of organized crime. So you see the complexity of this.
Yes. Okay. So do you feel like you've given enough about the geopolitical landscape that you're ready to get into the individual characters?
Well, I'd like to say this. I'd like to say that there were two fronts. The first front, of course, was the missile crisis. The second front was the ousting of Castro to appease the Florida community of anti-Castro Cubans, some of them good people. Some of them actually thought, this was the right thing to do. And so the CIA was under Bobby Kennedy. Not that he was head of the State Department, but he made a deal, maneuvered the CIA and organized crime to work together to get rid of Castro. And this was the greatest irony of the Kennedy assassination, because he blamed himself for setting up the mechanism that got to his brother. You see.
Yeah, okay.
So they were afraid of him. They knew that if he got in the White House, he would go after the people that killed his brother.
Oh, yeah, I would.
Yeah. This is why he played it very calm. He played it low. He didn't make any waves, but he was waiting for his chance, and they knew it.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm going to very quickly run down the list of the major players, just so people know that these are who they are. The first one is Oswald. The next one is David Ferry, who's the pilot we've talked about who lost his facial hair. Aristotle Onassis. Jack Ruby. A fellow named Tippett, who was the police officer. A lawyer. There's a lawyer involved who overhears their conversation. Casey Brennan, who was the backup patsy in case Oswald didn't work out. There was a cab driver. There's Abraham Zapruder. Earl Warren, who was the head of the Warren Commission, and Dorothy Kilgallen. So all of these people are major players in terms of how this story unfolds and how we get to the bottom of it. So you can take it anywhere you want to from there.
The Kennedy assassination and its cover-up, the killing actually took at least 50 people to effect, because you don't just try. You have to set something up that won't fail, because if you wound him, if he lives through it, you're done in, because this is an honest president that isn't going to put up with that. 50 people, a minimum. The cover-up took hundreds, including Earl Warren. Earl Warren, when he started the commission, said, we're here to prove that this is a country where such things, and you can fill that in as a conspiracy, because he had already made up his mind that he was there to prove Oswald did it, and Oswald did it alone. Well, there have been so many stories and so many ways of looking at this that there is a big pot of confusion being stirred continuously by well-meaning people and researchers that are not corrupt, but that fail to take in consideration that you need just one incredible overview to put things together. There's so much misinformation mixed in, disinformation, malinformation, and I have my own discerning thing there about malinformation. Malinformation is when you build a whole BS scenario, and your whole intent is to deny people access to the truth. And, of course, the government does that. There's disinformation. Disinformation can be honest. Disinformation can be misunderstandings. It can be a number of things. I know that I think it was Myrick gave me a link to a gentleman, I'd seen it before, who was just certain in his own mind that the shots came from the sewer, like portrayed in one episode of the X-Files. And other people have insinuated this, and most of this comes from the fact that at the lip of that sewer was found a bullet. It was picked up by a lady and turned over to the Secret Service and never heard of again, like so many other things. If you study the Zapruder film, now I'm not talking about some of the versions of the Zapruder film have been edited since they were studied by Thompson, who wrote the book 6 Seconds in Dallas. I suggest that if you really want to give this a thorough once-over, look at that book. You don't have a video or anything like that, but you have a book, and it's got some pictures that show a little different posture of the head when the head is exploded. There's a frame in there, and the head is pushed further back in the seat than it is in the video that this gentleman was using in this link. That's important because it puts the head out of view of anyone from any sewer in Dallas. It's out of view. He's pushed down in the seat because he has reacted to the acceleration of the car. The car has accelerated before the kill shot is made. That's very important. The shot comes from the front, and the only place that it could have come from is from someone in the car.
Yeah, I think that this is easier for people with an artistic bent to visualize because, for example, if you there's a beautiful sunset and you have this big block wall and it's just you can just barely see the top of it when you're up against the wall. You have to move back and back and back to get the whole thing. So as far as the sewer goes, it's on the ground, and if it's close to the car, you wouldn't even be able to see Kennedy.
No.
Sewer because
and
the
only sewer that would have been relevant to this would have been on the left side of the car as the car is going. It would have been close to the car. It would have been impossible. It had to shoot through the car.
That's right, yeah. Okay.
But there were shots from other sources. The first shot that hits Kennedy comes through Connolly.
Now, maybe that's a good time to explain the Connolly connection with Oswald.
Connolly was governor of the state of Texas at the time. He and his wife were sitting in the second row of seats back. Kennedy and his wife are sitting in the third seat. This is a limousine with 3 sets of seats. So that shot comes from the picket fence. It hits, you have to appreciate that the shot from the picket fence, you got other people in the way. You had Connolly in the way. So it hits Connolly and goes through Connolly and hits Kennedy. And he reacts and raises both of his hands up in the fist to his face. He starts forward like he's going to double up. And then all of a sudden he's pushed back by the acceleration of the car because the driver has reacted, and it's the driver that kills him. The driver knows exactly where his head will be when he accelerates the car. And the kill shot comes from up under the chin, goes up through the back of the head. And the reason that Jacqueline Kennedy tried to get out of the car over the back trunk was because she saw it.
She was moving in the opposite direction away from the shooter.
Yes.
Yeah.
If she had not seen it, why would she do that? Because if she thought the shots came from outside that car, wouldn't she get down?
Duck in the car? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So now this ties in with the lawyer who overheard a conversation and Oswald being brought into this under the guise of assassinating not Kennedy, but the other fellow.
Connolly, yeah.
Connolly, yeah.
Well, after Garrison's investigation was leaked, and that night Ferry was suicided, his picture showed up in the Dallas Morning News the next morning. and a taxi cab driver came down to the news desk of the Dallas Morning News as quickly as he could to say, this is the man that I drove from Love Field with Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald the day before the assassination, and I took him to the Carousel Club. Then there was a lawyer sitting in a booth at that time. When they came in, sat down in another booth, he identified them to the Warren Commission and gave the Warren Commission a verbatim transcript of their conversation. They threw it out because they said his memory was too good. Yeah, it was too good for them.
Yeah, so they were in on it, clearly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were part of the hundreds of people that went in for a cover-up. And they did. Some of them were convinced that you had been convinced, maybe with propaganda, mind control, who knows, that, oh no, the best thing for the nation is put this behind us as fast as we can. You care about the truth. Well, look what that has bought us.
Yeah, and I would venture a guess that that entire meme was implanted through the media into the collective consciousness. Oh, we just need to put it behind us so that they wouldn't ask questions.
You know what I said about Snowden when he came out? He would have sticking to his shoes disinformation. Not his fault. He gathered up what he could. Well, they told CIA agents, a lot of good people, who were nosing around and finding out uncomfortable things, oh, keep it under your hat. We had to do what we did because Kennedy was about to cause World War III. Just the opposite was true. But they didn't have all the facts. That's part of the thing that you feed. When you are in one of these assistant directors, whether it's the FBI or the CIA, you feed your agents what you think is best for them to do what you want them to do. You feed them misinformation, disinformation, and, you know, they find out later. That's one of the things that...
well, that's social engineering and perception management.
Yes. And they do it to their own people.
Is it not also true as well that in order to, at this time they pushed the lone gunman story really hard because in doing so, that means that people do not look for a conspiracy. So they had to convince people that only one man shot off 3 shots within 7 seconds from that window. I mean, it's the incredulity, isn't it, that people would have, like, no way that can happen. They can't have people asking that question and saying, no way that can happen. So they still push that storyline. Do you see what I mean?
Well, there was a tree in the way of a shot to the limousine at the time the shots were fired. There was a tree in the way of making a shot on the president from that window on the 6th floor of the school book depository. But there was a figure in the window that people saw. That figure was Casey Brennan. Casey Brennan, he had grown up in a family, a military intelligence family, and their closest family friend was David Ferry. David Ferry became his handler when they put this kid through MK-Ultra mind control. They had him convinced that he was the killer. And
they had Casey Brennan convinced that he had done it.
Yeah, they had him convinced. I talked to him, and I said, no way you could have done it. And he says, why is that? I said, there was a tree in the way. And he says, well, I don't remember that. And I said, well, you were handled. I said, that tree was cut down the day after the assassination. I went to Dallas and watched it.
Yeah,
so,
that's important, too, because you lived there, and so you went down
I lived
and
in Fort Worth.
this.
Yeah, it was 40 miles away. So I went there. I was shaken up by it. It made me sick. It made me absolutely sick. You see, all these players had been seen together by witnesses, and I'm including Tippett, I'm including Oswald, Ruby, Ferry. All of them had been seen together by different witnesses, people in the club. There's so many interesting things that go on, like how Ruby was able to get into the parking basement of the county police headquarters to kill Oswald, how just at the moment that they come around where they're in view of Oswald's still back behind a lot of people, horn blows. He steps out like it was a signal and sticks his gun into Oswald's belly. He fires one shot. Oswald's rushed to the hospital. The cause of death that is on the coroner's report is embolism. Embolism. In other words, they could have made sure that he was going to die by injecting air into his heart. That'd be possible. Of course, it isn't from any other cause. So that struck me as odd when I found that out. But Oswald was reputed to have killed Tippit in Oakland in front of the Texas Theater. Well, it's interesting that Oswald leaves. Oswald is standing in the entranceway of the school book depository at the time the shots are fired. This is in agreement with a witness, a lady that was in the swing room of the Texas book depository just before the shots are being fired. Oswald is down on the second floor, which is where the entrance is into the school book depository. He gets a Coke out of the machine and walks out the door to watch the procession. And she practically is watching him at the time the shots are fired. So he is on the second floor. He's not in the school book depository sixth floor window. That's Casey Brennan, who's been set up in case Oswald didn't work out, he would be the patsy. Oswald leaves. He heads to the boarding house where he's staying there in Dallas. His landlady hears a car honk outside and looks and sees it's a police car and can see the last two digits. There are 3 digits on their police car. She can see the last two, and they're the same as was on Tippit's car. Then Oswald shows up in Oak Cliff and is supposed to have killed Tippit. Well, probably Tippit drove him there. He got out of the car. He walked over to the theater. 2 witnesses saw a heavy-set Latin American man with dark bushy hair walk up and off Tippit. The officer on the scene describes the cartridges on the ground. They're .45 APC. Oswald is carrying a .38 Special Smith & Wesson with a faulty firing pin. So, of course, these witnesses change their testimony later on.
Well, now Tippit, to go back to him, he was the police officer who picked up Oswald. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And
More than likely.
Okay, and he, along with a lot of the people on the list I originally read, were suicided or murdered because of what they knew.
That's right. Well, Tippit had been seen in the club. He frequented the Carousel Club because he played to all the law enforcement people in Dallas. Ruby was a bagman. He made all kinds of deals with law enforcement, with DAs, whatever. He was Carlos Marcello's bagman in Dallas.
Okay, now what about the lawyer who heard the conversation? Do we cover that already?
What he heard was they were talking about offing Connolly.
Now,
what
and
I
that's
believe,
what Oswald was told, right?
Yeah, I believe that Oswald turned that over to the Secret Service. He was an agent. He was an undercover agent working for the CIA and the FBI both. You have to know something about his history, supposed affection, how quickly he was able to get back in the United States, the fact that he had top security clearance as a communications technician in the Navy, and that he was stationed at Suka, which is an island where they flew the U-2 out of. They wanted to use him as a double agent. They were tailoring him for that, and somewhere along the line, since they couldn't sell him to the Soviets, even after he supposedly defected and all that, he decides, well, he doesn't want to be an assembly line worker in the Soviet Union all his life, so he comes back to the United States, supposedly. All this is what in the CIA vernacular is called a legend. You build up a myth about somebody because you're setting them up for something in the future. That's called a legend. He was a legend.
Okay.
There's even a book written which refers to that, and it's written by somebody that was involved with him in the Marine Corps. He was actually a Marine.
Okay, so from your view, Oswald was being told that he was going to be involved in killing this senator, not the president.
Not senator, governor.
Governor, sorry.
Yeah.
I can't remember this person's name to save my life. Connolly, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. So he was, that's what he thought was going on.
Yeah.
And so in your view, Casey Brennan was the backup patsy in case Oswald figured it out?
And he did, but, they were able to have a scenario to nail Oswald down. And they used Tippit to do that, and since they weren't sure about Tippit, or to further incriminate Oswald, they killed Tippit. They cleaned up Ruby. Ruby spoke with Earl Warren before his death. And he told Earl Warren, and there's a transcript of the conversation, he told Earl Warren that if you'll get me out of here and take me back to Washington, D.C., I'll tell you everything. But if I say anything here, I'll be killed. And Earl Warren told him, if you're afraid that you might say something that would endanger you, then don't say it.
So Earl Warren, who was the head of the Warren Commission, was also dirty then?
With respect to this, he was. He had a distinguished career up until then. That's why he was so useful. But somebody had him convinced that for the good of the country, you've seen people that buy into that crap all the time. There'll be people that are listening to us right now that think that it's good to cover up bullshit.
Yeah.
You'll have it. I mean, I had a close friend that is no longer with us that once told me that he could understand why secrets are kept, and that was necessary, and I told him it does more harm than good. We had an intellectual disagreement. I don't believe in secrecy. If you have an ongoing military operation, I think that you should keep it quiet until it's over. And even Jesse Ventura agrees with this, and he was a SEAL. That's the only way that you can keep a government clean. If they have this national security BS, they can throw that blanket over anything that they do. They're necessarily going to become corrupt.
Yes, now people can look up Earl Warren on Wikipedia. He was the 14th Chief Supreme Court Justice. I mean, he wasn't just a nobody.
No.
He had a very distinguished career. Now, it's important to point out that Oswald was killed, David Ferry was killed, Jack Ruby was killed, the police officer Tippit was killed.
The only person to speak with Ruby from the press after he killed Oswald was Dorothy Kilgallen. And the day that she spoke to Ruby, that night she flew to New York, and she was on either that night or the next night, she was on this show, which was very popular. It was called What's My Line, and she was on the panel of What's My Line as a regular. And she was very famous. She was a celebrity, a lovely person. When she got back, she was going by a cameraman, and she told the cameraman, tomorrow I'm going to open this thing wide open. She's talking about the Kennedy assassination. And that night she died from an overdose of barbiturates and alcohol, and her friends all said, no friggin' way.
And she was the only journalist to talk with Jack Ruby.
After he killed Oswald, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So she definitely got the goods, I'm sure.
She had an interview with him in the county jail, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. All right, so let's talk about Aristotle Onassis, who ended up marrying JFK's widow. Who was he, and why was he
Onassis is very important because Onassis had put Joseph Kennedy in business bootlegging in Boston. And he would bring the booze in during Prohibition and deliver it to Joseph Kennedy. And that's how the Kennedy fortune began. Might have had some money before then, but that's how he became a multimillionaire and then some. Onassis was a shipping magnate, and he was so powerful and so able to control shipping worldwide that when Japan had contracted Kuwait's oil the first time, they were going to have refineries in Japan, build refineries. When they went to lease tankers, they couldn't find any tankers to lease. When they went to Ireland and other shipyards to try and to have tankers built for them so they could bring the Kuwaiti oil to Japan, they couldn't find anyone that would do it because Onassis had put the word out. That's how powerful he was. He was head of organized crime in the world. He was the godfather of the Kennedy family. And he told Joseph, he said, get your son in line. and Joseph Kennedy couldn't do it.
In
Either one
regards
of
to
them.
JFK.
And Bobby. Couldn't do it.
Bobby.
He couldn't do it. So when Kennedy gave those speeches, he put the contract out on himself, so to speak. And, of course, it had to be cleared all the way up and all the way down. And the whitewash had to be set. The first attempt was going to be during the Super Bowl. That didn't work out. So then it became that appearance in Dallas. And so it had to be set up, but they had a plastic bubble they were going to put on the car. Rumor is that LBJ said, no, don't do that. The Secret Service...
James, I didn't hear what you said. A plastic what on the car?
Bubble.
Like a bulletproof bubble, you mean?
It wasn't bulletproof, but with a high-powered rifle or any gun, it doesn't take much to deflect the bullet. The faster the velocity, the more easily it is to deflect the bullet.
Oh, okay. All right.
So, it would have made a difference. Would have proved, would have led to proving that the fatal shot came from inside the car.
That's right. Yeah, because the bubble would have been untouched.
It wouldn't have had the kill shot coming through it.
That's right.
And according to what Bill Cooper said, it was a special gun that was used.
For the kill shot.
For the kill shot, yeah.
And this is another thing that comes up when people look into this and investigate it. They come across the story of the assassins that were the hired assassins that were firing from the direction of the railway station. Picket fence, yeah. And you get this whole thing about the dum-dum bullet and it being an exploding bullet coming from that direction.
It couldn't have come from anything directly in front because there's a freeway there and an overpass. And where the car was, that would have been in the way. So if somebody was standing up there,
the windshield would have been in the way.
The windshield, it's not the windshield, it's the steel border around the windshield where there was an impression of a bullet hitting, and that would have been from the grassy knoll.
Oh.
Yeah.
There were shooters there, because they're the ones that get...
the first shot that hit him. But it wasn't fatal.
The guys, they were the guys that were disguised as tramps. We were talking about that the other night.
Yes, and there's the picture. When Police Chief Curry retired, he published his file. And in that book is a picture of those tramps that the police arrested behind the picket fence. And later on, there was a witness that said she saw them putting their guns in the trunk of a car there. They're arrested and they're brought back, and the picture shows them being led past the school book depository. They're supposed to be tramps, but one of them is wearing $300 or $500 alligator shoes. And also, I've seen his picture elsewhere. He is an assassin that goes by the code name Blue Fox. Nice looking guy. Looks like a movie star.
So the driver of the car shot JFK. Now, how did he do this? Did he turn around and do it, or did he?
Yeah. Okay. And you see it in the Zapruder film. In the unedited version, it's quite clear. But the version that everybody else has seen is, you have to go through the series of things to figure it out. But the guy that did that video, Myra, wasn't able to even conceive that it could be Secret Service. So that's why he knew it came from the front of the car. He could prove that. But he could not entertain the thought that it could be anyone in the car. But it was. But it was. It couldn't have been anybody from the sewer. That's just absolutely impossible. It had to come through the car.
Yeah, and also it's important to point out that scenario was in the X-Files.
Yeah. X-Files planted a lot of misinformation about a number of things. It over-dramatized a lot of things, but it was serving some social engineering too.
Yeah. Okay, so Oswald was killed, Ferry was killed, Ruby was killed, Tippett was killed, but strangely enough, Abraham Zapruder, the individual who took the Zapruder film, was not killed, nor was his film confiscated. Would you like to talk about that?
Everybody else that had a camera in Dealey Plaza during the shooting had their camera taken and the film removed, sometimes the camera, except Zapruder. Zapruder was shooting in the most prominent place of all. You can look at the Zapruder film and see that. Not only, now he takes it, and you don't hear of the Zapruder film, not for years later. Meanwhile, intelligence networks all over the world have, all over the world. finally it comes into the public venue, and it's edited. And Thompson, even though it was edited, Thompson did an excellent analysis of it in his book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. When I saw that, that's when I wanted to see the rest of it and figured out a way to do it. But there's very little doubt once you see it and you see the sequence of events, how it happened in the only way it could happen.
What happened to the driver afterwards? What happened to him?
Oh, he had an element of fame from it because there were people that were saying that he did it. And, of course, oh, no, and, of course, the horror media, what do? They're going to be just like Earl Warren, going to smooth over it every way they can, make anybody that says anything like that look like they're nuts or whatever. They're real good at that. But the more you know, and once you realize all these players and how they're interrelated, the fact that Oswald had privileged information, was treated in a privileged manner, and was the bodyguard for this girl that was doing the work for Dr. Mary that Crystal was talking about at the very beginning.
Dr. Mary Smokey, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what happened? Now you mentioned before, because we've talked about this privately many times. We've been wanting to do this for a long time. This particular show, you talked about before the Zapruder family being offered money. What do you think that was about?
Well, it comes out a few years ago. It was let out of the bag that the family, this is after the fact, the family was given a fortune. Presumably Zapruder was long dead, and the family was given, well over $1 million. And the only reason they would have given them that is to keep quiet about what they knew, like what the full edited version of the Zapruder film showed.
The unedited version, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, to keep them from ever releasing it, if they still had it or whatever.
Well, of course they know they may not be in possession of it, but they know what was on it. Of course they do.
I see.
And of course, in the gemstone file that Cooper, now I'm not going by the gemstone file. There are a lot of things I'm in agreement with the gemstone file, but that's not where my information comes from, because all the versions of the gemstone file, including the one that Bill Cooper had read, and he knew this too, was peppered with this information. It's just too, you put, when you get these sources, you put what makes sense together, and then you don't say anything about it until it's inevitably true. It's the only way that things fit together. Then you can. That's my principle. That's my guiding light principle in everything. In one of the versions of the gemstone file, the one that Cooper had, I think Cooper had read or had been sent 3 different versions of the gemstone file. In one version, Zapruder is a Zionist who was placed there. The Mossad already knew, according to this version of the gemstone file, that this was going to take place, and their part in an agreement to keep quiet about it and to go along with the program was that they could film it. And Zapruder was their agent in filming it. Now, I don't know. I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying it's even likely. But I'm just giving you a version. It makes sense. But, I am not one to defame someone on any information as tenuous as that. But that was in the gemstone file. Now, there were some things in the gemstone file I knew to be true.
Are those things we've covered or things you would like to share?
No, they're associated with something else.
Okay.
Other things.
Okay, let's talk about the one thing that we haven't covered so far is Jackie Onassis having married Aristotle Onassis. What was all that about?
It's the only way she could stay alive. And he had been a friend of the family. He was very fond of her. He had to be her handler from then on because she saw who shot. That's why she married him. Why would she marry him?
So
otherwise?
she was his trophy and he was her handler to keep her alive.
Well, trophy is true because in organized crime, the highest tribute is to take the wife of the man that you've put down.
And you've mentioned before, even though she was in a very precarious situation, she did fight back. How did she do that? How did she try to get even with him?
She would buy very expensive dresses and sell them for a fraction of what she paid for them. And many of them she never wore. And she made a habit of this, and it was just to spend his money. Of course, he had so much it didn't make any difference to him. And he probably liked her and cared about her. I doubt if he ever slept with her, because that wasn't the point.
The arrangement, okay. Is there anything else about this that we haven't covered that you would like to, James?
There are so many people that were murdered and killed to keep this all quiet. I knew a guy that came out with the first book, and this was in '66, Forgive My Grief. At that time, there were close to 70 people that had been either witnesses or had known personally witnesses. People like the bartender in the Carousel Club, 2 of the showgirls there, a railway worker that was in a tower across the freeway that had a line of sight to the assassination. Just all kinds of people that died mysteriously or were suicided or whatever, like the bartender who was a heavyset guy, weighed about 300 pounds. He falls through a window, supposedly, and has his chest. Yet Marilyn Monroe, just, you know, the ramifications and the cross currents. People, like, for instance, there was a lieutenant commander who was in charge of the naval part of the National Archives. He had boasted that he knew where in the National Archives were x-rays of Kennedy's head after the assassination while he was at Parkland. He had boasted about this, and somebody, he said, that's my retirement or whatever. You know how you can be loose about what you have to say. Well, there was a young kid at the time who had just got out of boot camp as a Marine, and he was such a good shot that they tried to get him into a sniper school. And so he went to this special school, and while he was in this special school, he was approached. The fellow that approached him identified himself as a government agent, and he said, would you consider taking a hit out on an officer, a U.S. officer, in the national interest? And he said, in the national interest? And he said, yeah, for the good of the nation. And he said, yeah, I would consider it. And he said, where is this hit to be made? And the guy told him in the National Archives, and the kid said, no way, I won't shoot an officer in the United States. Now, this was on 2020. This was on a documentary on television.
Wow.
And so the kid told this agent, well, you might go over and talk to so-and-so. He just wanted to get rid of him. He doesn't know whether this other guy he knew had anything to do with it or not. But this agent had made the mistake of giving him the name of this lieutenant commander. So it's a few weeks later, he's reading in the paper that this guy got killed in the National Archives. So, you know,
yeah,
that's another one. And it just mounts up. Today, I would say if you really got down to brass tacks, as many as I've counted, I think is in the 90s, I would say it's probably close to 200 people
that were killed to keep this quiet.
Yeah, that have been killed in cleanup operations since. I knew the guy that wrote the book, Forgive My Grief. He wasn't killed, but he had a newspaper in Midlothian, Texas, and I personally knew this guy, and so it was bombed.
Wow, his newspaper building was bombed?
His newspaper was bombed. He was put out of business. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that's gone on. There's just a string of this, and people that say there was no conspiracy, I don't know what to think of them. I really don't.
In the British documentary that I was talking to you about today that was made in 1988, what's interesting about that is the fact that it was made in 1988, so you've still got people that were there at the time being interviewed. And one of them was Beverly Oliver, who was the showgirl who witnessed Ruby and Oswald together. And she actually says in that interview that she didn't want to come forward because, you know, she more or less implies that she was scared to come forward initially because too many people were showing up with strange circumstances around their death, so to speak.
First one was a bartender, and that was one of her friends.
Yeah, that's right. She mentions Jada, one of the strippers. They were together as well that night. I think she saw them together frequently, and she died. I don't know how she was killed or whatever. I don't know the details about that. But
she was a girlfriend of Tippett.
Right, okay.
Oh, so they killed Tippett and his girlfriend.
Oh, they killed everybody that could connect Tippett to Oswald and Ruby.
So you cut out just a little bit, and I only caught the end of what you said, and I heard you talking about Marilyn Monroe. What did she know that would have put her in danger?
Marilyn Monroe, her boyfriend, was in the mob. They had tried to compromise JFK with her. JFK wouldn't have anything to do with it. She even, during one of his birthday bashes, to honor JFK when he was president, sang this song to him. And everybody thought, oh, well, he's hitting that, right? Yeah. Well, he wasn't. But Bobby, on the other hand, Bobby was seen at her place and so forth. He probably was.
Sly dog.
Well, it was after Bobby had visited her that she dies that day. He leaves the place, and not long after that, she's found dead. So they were doing their best to get some kind of blackmail card on Bobby and JFK, and it just didn't work. It didn't pan out. Of course, that doesn't have anything to do with the assassination, but it is typical of the type of cross currents going on at the time.
It sounds like she was meant to be a form of honey trap that they could use.
She was, yeah. Well, I think that Marilyn Monroe was very intelligent. She was very gifted. She was loyal. I don't think she was a great actress, but she was a good person. She had stayed with Norman Mailer when he was going through being persecuted by the Red Scare of Joseph McCarthy. She'd been very loyal to him. Joe DiMaggio, after they divorced, just stayed her friend, would help her in any way he could. So she was not a typical starlet by any means, but I think that they got something on her, or they had subjected her to some kind of treatment or whatever. But I don't think she owned herself during that period of time.
I see.
The other thing is that I was going to say about, we were talking about younger members coming into this whole story, like in the audience, people are that bit younger. And I know that, there's a lot of people in their 30s and whatnot that are fascinated by CSI and pathology and what happens to bodies in murders and mysteries and so on. And the thing that struck me looking at this story again was how quickly they got hold of his body. And the pathologist at the time, there was no doubt that the back of his brain, was literally shot out the back of his head. We've talked about the kill shot coming from the front, okay? Yeah. So there is the funeral director that was brought in is interviewed and states that he put Kennedy's body in a shroud in a very expensive, because he was the president after all, coffin, because they were all saying we have to get the body to Washington. And in fact, there was bad language used. And the funeral director talks about that because he felt embarrassed for the priest that was there. So these Secret Service thugs are coming in and saying, let's get him out of here. He's put in this coffin and then flown out to Washington. Is that right? And the pathologist...
He's on the same plane that LBJ is on, flying back to Washington, right, D.C. Okay.
So the pathologists that are there that meet the body, that unpack, so to speak, JFK, describe the coffin as being completely different, and JFK is in a black body bag inside that coffin, which is zipped up from head to toe or whatever, just like a body bag they'd put you in if you were in a bomb or a disaster of some kind.
Yeah, Myriad, it shouldn't be any surprise because they did the same thing to the car.
Okay, so they did the same thing to the car, right?
Yeah.
So was the car destroyed? Was it impounded? What happened to the car?
All kinds of rumors about that, but my guess would be it was destroyed as soon as they could get it to where it could be destroyed without being seen.
Sure.
But all sorts of rumors. People have been trying to sell it all over the world, say, well, this is a car and all that, because you probably fetch a pretty penny to somebody that wanted that as a kind of collectible. A hell of a collectible.
So they go as far as doing that, getting rid of the car and also cutting the tree down, is that right? Because you went after their... You
the day
said
after.
the tree was cut down.
Yeah, the day after.
And they even pulled up bits of pavement at one point because somebody who was under the bridge had a blood spatter on them, and there was a whole story about, the position of the shooter in relation to that, and they went and drilled up or dug up some of the pavement. It's just incredible. It's so...
They were rewriting history.
Yeah.
It's like I said, at least 50 people were involved in the assassination, and hundreds were involved in the cover-up. And these are mostly people that, are policemen, Dallas policemen, people in the sheriff's department, FBI, Secret Service, CIA. They were involved in the cover-up. And, even very distinctive or distinguished people like Earl Warren involved in the cover-up. The papers, they weren't going to print anything that hadn't been approved. Mm-hmm. And they weren't going to buck any ways because the scuttlebutt was, well, we want to stick to the lone gunman theory. And that's what they did. That's exactly what they did. Not tolerate any discussion otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything else that you would like to cover about this, Myriad or James, or do you feel like...
This has haunted this country ever since, and it has led to emboldening the same monsters, or heirs to the same ancestry as the monsters then, mm-hmm. to do even worse, like 911, like the massacre of all those people at Waco, like the destruction of the Murray building, like all of this, and then the phony false flags that we've had, like Sandy Hook and the Aurora Theater, and on and on and on. And all of this is part of social engineering, and it should be no surprise to anybody. We see the thumbprint of the same thing that happened in Syria going on in Ukraine right now. It's come out who's responsible for doing all the sniping of killing people on both sides in Kiev. We see that there are people now that have come forth and shown that the people that they're behind putting in power in Kiev or in the Ukraine are Nazis. I mean, plain and simple, these people are Nazis. I mean, they're not extreme right-wingers, they're Nazis. This is untenable. To have this country supporting that element in a country where Russia has the same right to impose itself, to protect itself on its hinterland that we have on ours. We wouldn't tolerate this happening anywhere in this hemisphere. And yet, we're ready to go to war with Russia for doing the same thing we'd do? This is preposterous.
Yeah. Would you agree, James, that the success that they had in covering up the JFK assassination not only emboldened them, but set the tone for how they were going to, how far they were going to go from there on out because they could get away with it?
Yeah. The report from Iron Mountain is a good example of how they could turn around on a dime and go the opposite way than would be enjoined by an aware free society. They turn a study that a president commissioned to find out what the social consequences and economic consequences would be if we no longer had the need for a defense industry like we had. Right? Mm-hmm. They turn that around to how we can take over the world and install a one world government under the same bastards that have caused all these problems.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to cover this story and get to the bottom of it, because this is where a lot of this really started.
Yeah, absolutely. The kids today that are interested in this and want to get to the bottom of it, I congratulate them wholeheartedly, because I think that they're aware more than their mothers and fathers were of how important this is for us to fully resolve it and find out the guilty parties, just like with 911. Then we can put it behind us. But until we do, we're destined to repeat the same thing over and over again. And we have.
And that's because the methods that they're using keep working because people aren't exposing what they do. And that's been a huge change in the last couple of years as far as, the awakening process, is that they use the same MO over and over and over again. So once you identify the pattern, you can see it everywhere. Like, getting rid of the car, of the JFK assassination. Look what they did at 9/11. Look how fast they got rid of all that metal.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Sandy Hook.
Oh,
the
yeah.
school is gone. They did,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's the same thing over and over and over. And I think that once people get that, they won't tolerate it anymore because they'll see it unfolding as they're trying to do what they're doing. And, the Boston Marathon bombing, people tore that apart instantly. The same thing with the Sandy Hook school. People are onto them, and it's a really sad thing as far as the powers that be are concerned, because it's the same 3 pages of the playbook over and over and over again, and people are onto it.
Well, we have to congratulate the young people that were involved in spotting those crisis actors and pointing them out, doing everything they could. And look at the conflict they came under. We know we're saving our nation. It's only hope we have of saving our nation to stand up and point these things out and keep the pressure on, keep people aware, because it has made a difference with the young people today. Too many of us, older people like myself, like to point to them and say, oh, they didn't have a good education. They've gone through this and that, and they can't even give change. No, that's not true. These people are sharp. They have different skills than we have, and they're good at what they do, and they're sharp kids, and they deserve the truth, and they know it, and I love them.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Did you have anything that you would like to add, Myra?
Yeah, I agree with James. I think for the younger generation, I think it's really important. I was born in 61, and I've always had a fascination for what happened with Kennedy. And I agree that it all starts at that point because of the potential that he had to be so much greater, and how the world would have been different if he hadn't been killed, and also Bobby as well. Let's not forget poor old Bobby was assassinated. So, historically looking back, it's just such an incredible time period. And you still watching it today, I was still incredulous. I still thought, my God, they did that. They got away with doing that to his body and taking his brain out as well. That's the other part of the pathology side of it. Because that kill shot, that shot from the front was so important that they had to cover that up so that, they couldn't even allow them to section his brain the way they would have done had they had access to it. You see what I mean? They went so far to cover it up. And that's another thing that people need to see and understand and appreciate. And it takes a while for your mind to wrap itself around the whole story. But when you do, you get this incredible objectivity of the whole picture.
Do you know, Mary, that the brain was, what was left of the brain was consigned to the National Archives?
Mm-hmm.
It's disappeared too.
God. Yeah.
And I think the other thing that's important to point out is that the way that these people have operated in tying up the loose ends, people who could point them out for who and what they've done, were all taken care of. They were all killed one way or another, bribed, however you want to look at it. If we pan the camera out at what's happening today, and I've said this many times and I really believe it, I really believe that the overpopulation lie that they're selling is the genocide that they're working on, because we're all waking up.
Yeah.
It's interesting how they tried to vilify. In order to make Oswald look as guilty and as criminal and as psycho and whatever as they could, they tried to pin a supposed attempt on General Walker. That he tried before the assassination of JFK, that he was the likely attempted assassin of General Walker. And there was nothing that would fly that. But that was how desperate they were, because the more bad things they could say about him. And, what's really interesting is that Life magazine came out with a picture of him standing there with that man like a carbine and a gun on his hip. And when he saw it, they show it to Oswald after he's in custody. He says, the face is me, but the body is not. And if you look at that picture that was on the front of Life magazine at the time, now you guys probably never seen a Life magazine because they went out of business when you were still young ladies, very young ladies. But this was a big Catholic magazine that came out, I think, every week. And always had great photographs in it and everything. And there is Oswald on the front of that magazine, that picture. It's his face. And if you look at it, the sun is coming straight down on his upper lip. You know, his nose is casting in. It should be at a 12 o'clock position to do that. And then there's a slanted shadow. So he's right. They've taken his head and put it on somebody else's body. And that has been forensically examined so many times, and everybody that does says the same thing. They were putting a hard sell on that from all directions. Like I said, hundreds of people were involved in the cover-up and in the publishing business too. And of course, Life was Catholic. You know, people that owned it were devout Catholics. And it always, you know, touted Catholicism. But here again, even though Kennedy was Catholic, it's still towing the party line.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much, James, for taking the time to go through all of this. And I do want to point out to people that we have provided this information into the collective for free. People have the right to share it any way they want to, with two exceptions, that nothing said here is changed and that it is always shared for free. It's very important. If we wanted somebody to get rich off of this information, we would have written the book and sold it ourselves. You know, it's important that everybody has access to it.
And then we'd be in the cottage industry like so many of these other people that have an agenda. We don't have an agenda. Our purpose, we have a purpose. It's not an agenda. And if you want to know the difference between a purpose and an agenda, you know, use Wikipedia for something. What we want to do is we want to avert the program of the New World Order as much as possible for the sake of humanity.
Yeah, it's not a survivable program if it fully manifests.
No.
Yeah, that's super.
If Fukushima and the Gulf of Mexico disaster doesn't tell you that, nothing will.
I'm sorry, did I have my mute on?
Didn't hear you.
I think yes.
I apologize. I was asking Myrid if she had any closing remarks she would like to make.
It just is so important to really go into it and examine it. If you're going to look at the assassination of JFK, it's incredibly interesting and it's incredibly sad that they got away with it and with the cover-up. And I think we owe it to the people who were, the generations here around now looking at the other false flags. You know, we owe it to the ones that were killed as part of that cover-up to keep going and looking for the truth and getting the truth out there.
Yeah, it's very important. We owe it to ourselves and our children. All of the generations. You know, if they want to survive, they're going to have to recognize the patterns that are going to prevent that, so that they can change them. That's really, really important. I'm sorry, that's my dog in the background. Apparently, he has closing remarks, which is why I always use my mute button.
Yes, he has a stake in this.
Apparently he does. He thinks so. Yeah. So I apologize for that. But Dave did ask what we would like to name this show, and so I would like for you to name it, James. What would you like the title of the show to be?
Let's not repeat history. Or let's stop repeating history.
That's perfect. I like it. All right. Well, again, I appreciate everything that you've shared with us tonight, James, and I hope the listeners found it meaningful as well. It's important. You know, there have been very pivotal key moments in our past where we had the ability to change everything and put everything back on track, and that was one of those moments, and we missed it. And I don't know that we're going to get too many more.
That's right.
So we shouldn't waste them. So, all right. Well, I'm ready to call it a night. Are you there, Dave?
Why, yes, I am.
All right. Well, thank you so much for letting us go over again. You're always very gracious about that. Thank you.
Oh, I'm grateful that you're all here. This gives me something to do on a Friday night.
All right, works out.
Well, we enjoy this opportunity, and we thank you very much.
It's interesting because you've brought out truths and evidence that I've never heard anywhere else for both subjects, the Coneheads revealed and the JFK assassination truths revealed.
Yeah, well, there's so many people that have contributed to my knowledge of this. I think that it is a shame that they murdered Bill Cooper, who, if he were here right now together, if I had him to help me put this together, we could have done a lot better job than I just did.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I'd like to make a suggestion that we say, let's not repeat history, Coneheads truth and JFK assassination truths revealed.
Okay. Yeah, I had that to it. Sure.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much. I'll be happy to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And Miss McDonald, I still love you.
Even though I was late.
We all love you, my dear.
Oh, thank you. It's a love fest.
It is.
Yeah.
You see, if you can't have fun doing something, why do it at all?
Exactly.
And to me,
That's right.
This is the greatest delight and pleasure in my life is to be able to own and actually produce for all the marvelous hosts I have. And if you haven't sent me a short bio and a picture yet, do it, please.
I know you're not talking to me.
I'm not talking to James.
He's talking to me.
I'm talking to Ms. McDonald.
Is it Miss McDonald because you can't pronounce my first name? Would that be right?
Yes, I think so. He's dodging.
I'm trying to be very polite.
Dave, can you say married?
Married?
Yeah.
I can
had to
say
be
married.
Told too. I had to be told too.
Yes, Miss
Married.
Married.
Phonetically, it's like MY-RED. Myred.
Yeah.
Yes, Lady Married, I can say that.
Okay. Well done.
And my dog is saying it too, so I think I need to feed him. I better go.
Guys, good night. Good night. Enjoyed it.
All right. Good night, you guys. It was a pleasure as always.
Thanks, Steve. Good night.
This is Wolf Spirit Radio.